The differences between the Sunset Strip and Nashville. Now, when I left Los Angeles in 1994, after playing on the Strip, and my band imploded, and realizing that if I stayed in Los Angeles, nothing was probably going to change, and I needed to do something different. And I knew Nashville was starting to become hot again, but I had no idea what Nashville was like. I didn't fly there first and scope it out. I just said, my friends, the Wooten brothers, are there, and I'm going to go to Nashville and make it happen. And so I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Now, at the time, there were still, bands playing on the Strip, and the Strip was still, relatively busy, but it wasn't the height of the Sunset Strip scene in 1994. So I moved to Nashville in 1994, 2 weeks before the Northridge earthquake. And man, I got calls back to Nashville. I got calls from my girlfriend, and it was just so alarming. And I was like, just leave, just come now. She was calling me, and their house was destroyed, and her cats were floating down the street, and it was just absolutely chaos. And, I had left Los Angeles, and, the plan was for her to eventually follow me to Nashville. And when this Northridge quake happened, I was like, just get in the car, just get out of there, just leave. And I'd always felt like California, you heard in the Steely Dan song, California tumbles into the sea. And I was a huge Steely Dan fan, and I always felt like we were on borrowed time out in Los Angeles, between the Rodney King riots and, the crime and just the madness of LA. I knew I just needed to get out of there. And so I left in 94. And then shortly after I left, I think around the same time as the, Northridge quake, there was a huge ice storm in Nashville, and it knocked out the power. The ice had gotten on the power lines, and I was living in this apartment near the Stewart's Ferry area, a nice place. And the ice had formed on the power lines and pulled the power lines down. And so I was without power for, it was probably like 3 or 4 days, just cold in this apartment, tucked in the bed. And I had a battery powered TV, I think, that I was, getting my news and watching stuff on, and just like this. And I remember there was a restaurant down the street, or a convenience store. And at some point I walked down the street to that, and I guess they had a generator or something. I was able to get something to eat. But man, that was a tough introduction. One, leaving and then hearing about this mass destruction and all my old friends were going through out in Los Angeles, and now I'm here and my girlfriend's there. And then I'm going through an ice storm. It just, either way you slice it, it appeared it was not going to be easy. But there were some major differences between the two areas, and especially musically. Now, 94 in Nashville, it was, mid-90s country, and, there was Mark Colley and Marty Stewart, and Garth Brooks had been, going big now for a couple of years. And, there was CMT and they would play music videos all the time. And so I would listen and I would watch and try to get an idea. And Little Texas was a band that came out at the time. And I always thought, they looked to me like, a rock band that decided to go country. And I think it wasn't shortly after I'd been there that Alan Jackson put out the song Gone Country, because I think a lot of people had the idea around that time to get out of Los Angeles. And so that was kind of an amusing poke at that, the fact. But at that time, Nashville was not a boom town. Downtown Nashville was pretty dead. Not a whole lot going on. It was kind of seedy. It was kind of rough down there, but more rough in the fact that it was kind of deserted and not a lot of people down there. Now, I didn't come to Nashville to play country music. I just came to, do something different, play different music. And, I started out playing smooth jazz in some of the classier places downtown. But, I started noticing big differences in the way songs were written, the way songs were produced. And, most notably, one thing I immediately noticed, in Los Angeles, you were trying to come up with a riff. You were trying to come up with a signature original part, and you would write songs built around a riff. Now, in order to play riffs, it's probably a next level from somebody that just plays cowboy chords. In order to create a riff, you've got to be able to kind of play all over the neck and move around and try and create something original to the song. But I started noticing that Nashville was full of these songwriters, and the majority of them, a lot of them, only knew their cowboy chords. So what they would do is they would move a capo around and try to create interesting ways to make the same 4 or 5 chords sound unique. And I started noticing early on that, there's these guys that write these songs are not like great guitar players. There's obviously always a few exceptions, but the majority of these guys were just cowboy chord knuckleheads. And they would go around town with their tackaminis and their capos, and they would play these little rider rounds. And if you went to one of these things and you were in the audience, you couldn't talk and you couldn't have fun. You couldn't whoop it up in the club like you were going to see a rock band, because people would be going, shh, shh. And these guys would be regaling you with their latest syrupy ballad or mid-tempo strummer. And I was just kind of like, these guys really don't know how to play guitar. And they're not really writing original music. They were good, generally very good at lyric writing, but they weren't really coming up with anything original musically. And the thing is, yes, a lot of those, country songs have really cool signature parts, like the intro to Chattahoochee or, any number of those 90s country songs. They would have killer little guitar, intros and things like that. And I started to realize, man, that's the studio guys coming up with that stuff. These writers aren't writing any of that. And those parts, a lot of times, are what make the song memorable. Because, man, after a while, if you took those signature parts out of those songs, these songs would just be the same 4-chord strummy, acoustic songs. There really wouldn't be much difference, except for the different singers that are, slapped on top of the song. So, I started going, man, what is going on down here? And at the time, Nashville, and it always kind of was, it was a combo amp town. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Los Angeles, man, you'd never use a combo amp on a gig. It was always like 50-watt Marshall head and a 412 cab. And yeah, the sound guy might say, hey, can you bring the guitar down a little bit? But generally they understood, like, we didn't use a lot of pedals, so you had to kind of pretty much crank the amp to get your gain. And it's a whole different world where Nashville was all about, a deluxe reverbs or Vox AC30s. And I also remember around the time Matchless became a really hot amp at that time. And if you could afford one, and they were expensive amps, I think they were maybe $3,000 back in those days. If you could afford one of those, man, you were top shelf, because those were really cool sounding amps, but a totally different thing than, the Marshall, LA type thing. But I used to come to, when I came to Nashville, I'm like, well, everybody's got these little wimpy guitar sounds, and, I thought it was kind of amusing. But later, as time went on, you started seeing more of these studio guys would have like they'd all have at least one Marshall head, one British sounding head, or a bassman, a Fender bassman. They would have more firepower in their amp racks, because as the music changed and they needed bigger guitar tones and more overdrive and things like that to power some of this modern country that came about, they started ditching the combo amps, and they would have these amp racks with a bunch of Fender amp head and a some kind of Matchless amp head and then a Marshall or something like that. And then they would be able to quickly switch between the different style of amps depending on what the song required. So, man, you had a huge difference in the whole process, the whole writing, the whole recording process, with LA. Generally, if you were in a band, generally you would play on your record. Now, if you weren't good enough to pull off the parts, kind of like, the guys in Warrant, they were acquaintances of my band in LA. We shared a similar booking agent, locally. And man, it was really disheartening, and to hear that, those guitar players didn't play on that record. And I heard that way back when. But, the producer makes the call in this situation. And he made the call that, hey, we're competing with Eddie Van Halen and George Lynch and Steve Lynch and, all these other guys who have all this chops and play these great solos. So I'm going to bring in somebody to play, some parts. And so, if you were one of those guys that couldn't, rise to the level that the producer wanted, kind of like the drummer, in the band Cinderella. From what I understand, he didn't play on those records. And I'm sure there's many, even the Tubes, who were, when they did that album with David Foster, David Foster brought in Steve Lukather because I heard him in a seminar say, well, I brought in Steve Lukather because those guys couldn't play their way out of a paper bag. I was like, whew, that's rough. But that's the reality. Producers ultimately make the call. But in Nashville, the difference would be they had all these ringers, all these great guitar players, the Brent Masons and all these kind of guys that would come in and play on these songs. And they were ringers because here's the thing, man. And here's the huge issue I have with Nashville and that system. Now, granted, look, those guys were working and they were thankful for the work, and it seemed like the work would never end. Of course, trends come and go, and players, come and go in and out of favorability. But, man, those Nashville guitar players that wrote and came up with those signature parts, they generally don't get any writing credit at all on the song. So that signature intro to Chattahoochee, man, you just came up with that. You just helped make that song. You helped make that song unique. You helped make it what it was, a signature part that everybody can walk away humming. And you get nothing but what you were paid to play the session and a little bit of mailbox money down the line. So that's a bitter pill to swallow, because the thing about Nashville is, you are brought into a Nashville session, and I'm not like a huge Nashville session guy, but I did play on a good, dozen or so Nashville style sessions. And, I did have some success playing with one of the artists that I played for would bring in his guys in the studio. So that's how I earned my plaques, my gold and platinum plaques for playing on country records. But the reality is, these players, these Nashville session guys, even the drum feels and the bass parts and maybe signature piano parts that make these songs, they're not getting any writer's credit whatsoever. And here's why I have issue with that. When you hear a Nashville demo and it's just a songwriter and he's just strumming his chords with his capo on his guitar, that's sometimes all that's on the demo. Now, other times, they might have gone to a demo studio and had a different set of players play on it. And a lot of times, sometimes, the master session players will listen to the demo. If there's something that works, a signature part that's working, and they like it, sometimes they'll just play the part that was on the demo. So then it's even more removed from, say, the original part. But, I just don't... Look, here's the thing, man. Some of those demos, they're just, you hear it and you go, this is just another boring 3-chord song that nobody came up with anything original except for, it's got good lyrics and maybe it's got a good title and maybe a good melody. But there's nothing that differentiates itself from anything else out there. And the same could be said, a lot of times these songs, sometimes these demos you hear are just absolutely dreadful. And these songs are just absolute garbage sometimes. And so your job as a studio guy is to hear it, make a quick number chart, or sometimes the leader will make the number chart and pass it around. And then you literally got seconds to go from the control room into the studio and come up with a signature part or a direction or something to do with this, to polish this turd. You've got to polish this turd. And man, that is where I salute these guys that do this day in and day out. This is where I salute them and learned, okay. It's not that they're, have these massive tones, and it's not that, these songs have these amazing riffs, but these guys are having to make the best of what they're given. And sometimes they can take that turd and polish it up and come up with a cool guitar part, and boom, they've got a hit song. So, man, these studio guys are making this music. They are the ones coming up with these signature parts and these signature licks that immediately when you hear the song, you go, that's that song. But without those signature parts, it would just be another song of a guy, it'd be a folk song, essentially. So it's the studio guys in Nashville that make the song, that make the parts, but they're not compensated. No one says, hey, Brent Mason, that was an incredible signature line you put. I'm going to give you a writer's credit. Nobody does that. They all just want to make their money and stay in their little box. And the writers would stay in their little box. And the studio guys stay in their little box, and the producers in their box. And it's like nobody goes, hey, Brent Mason, let's get together and help me write a signature part for my song, and I'll give you a writing credit. It's not done, and it should have been done. These guys should have been compensated and should be getting mailbox money, but I'm not sure. With the country world, country seems to constantly churn out new product. And it seems like the past is kind of maybe relegated to satellite radio and stuff like that, because it's not like the classic rock world. If you'd have written, Stairway to Heaven, you'd still be getting checks today because it's still getting airplay. If you'd have written, Teen Spirit, It Smells Like Teen Spirit, you'd still be getting royalty checks. If you'd have written, Honky Tonk Woman by the Stones, you'd still getting royalty checks. And I don't know as far as country royalty checks. I had been told at one time, this was shortly after I got to Nashville, and I sat down with a Nashville producer, and I said, well, look, if I wrote a number one song, how much money am I talking about? And he said something like, I thought he said $100,000 a quarter. And you would get that money as long as that song stayed hot, but, it would fade. And that's all from royalties of, radio play. Once that song fades from radio play, then those checks would wane off and wean off, into almost nothing, I would imagine. But while the song was hot, you would be, in getting airplay, you'd be getting these royalty checks from that period. That is where, the rock era was a very lucrative era and a gravy train for the guys that wrote those songs, because they're still getting airplay. Now, the hair metal thing, not as much. It's relegated to satellite radio and Spotify and YouTube and all that stuff. So the main, progenitors, maybe Dokken is played a little bit. Metallica is certainly made the cut, and they're considered classic rock. You hear them on the classic rock stations. But Van Halen, you would hear. Probably Dokken, not as much. You're not going to hear Wasp, except maybe on satellite radio. You will hear Guns N' Roses. There's a big difference between those two scenes, whether it's the Sunset Strip, where guys would write riffs and write songs, and maybe the songs and the lyrics would not be as good as a Nashville production, but the songs would have unique guitar riffs that were written by a guy who could actually play guitar, beyond just a basic level. And on the other hand, Nashville would have these guys who would just, kind of pen and paper guys back in the day, who would pen these really, great or creative or cute, lyrics, and but they weren't like great guitar players. The great guitar players were the guys that played on the songs in the studio. But when I first moved to town, the guitar styles changed, and later on you had some rock guys that worked their way into the country sessions, and some different styles in addition to the chicken picking kind of Brent Mason style guitar players, because styles and things come and go. And just like the Sunset Strip, now has faded off and become kind of a museum, country music of old has faded off. And now we have this new hip hop influenced modern country, and it's produced in a different way. It uses different players. And the emphasis is not on these signature, guitar chicken picking type lines of 90s country. But there is a huge difference between those two scenes.